Hi, and welcome back to Metaconscious Leaders. We're going to do something a little different today. I want to share with you how Metaconscious Leaders came about and a little about the vision. And I'd like to do so by looking at these extraordinary times that we're living in through 4 different lenses, because they each intersect and form the foundation on which Metaconscious Leaders was founded. First, though, a little about me. Like many people, I've spent most of my life mulling over the perennial big little questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What is the whole purpose of this happening? What is my purpose? As a teenager, I was fascinated by the extraordinary, stories of yogis in the East, the consciousness of nature, and the sense that there was something deeper, something more than, sitting beneath existence. I also had a very religious upbringing, which shaped that inquiry. Then life happened. I got busy, I entered business, I worked in large corporations, and when I felt restless, I completed an MBA and became an entrepreneur. I built small businesses in environmental services, in healthcare and internet technologies, and then became a coach and so forth. But along the way, I kept encountering roadblocks, moments that completely disrupted my plans and redirected my life in ways that I hadn't intended. Looking back, the toughest periods of my life were also the most rewarding. They coerced me to let go of what I thought was true or normal, and they opened me up always to a greater awareness of my innate and intimate connection with the ground of being, something that I thought of as more than, so as not to give it a specific name. I've had experiences that have taken me beyond belief to knowing that reality is not limited to what we perceive through our 5 senses. I've had a near-death experience. I've experienced moments during which I perceived everything as shimmering energy and light. Nothing was solid or physical. I've experienced states of consciousness that were expansive, beautiful, and profoundly rapturous. Most notable about all of these experiences and others was that they all felt more real and more normal than ordinary waking life. Now, I'm not exceptional. I know many people who've had similar experiences, and you may have done so also. And this is the point. We all, I think, are just a perception, just an intention away from perceiving a reality that is different to how it appears. There's a large part of me that would quite happily go and live in a cave and explore all of this further. But there's a much larger part that insists on being practical, on engaging with the world that I've been born into, even if that reality isn't quite what it seems. I've also noticed something else, which is that very few of my plans have unfolded the way that I've expected. In a conventional sense, even, most of them have failed. And yet, what has unfolded has been extraordinary, as though it had been shaped by an invisible hand with purpose. And again, when I speak to others, I hear this same story in different forms, and they invariably include a healthy serving of synchronicity. Einstein was once asked what he thought the purpose of life was, and he replied, "To be in service. What else could it possibly be?" It's the second part of that answer which really strikes me. To be in service is a most natural state. Whether we acknowledge it or not, we're all in service. Over the past few years, I've become aware of an extraordinary number of people from all walks of life who are in service to the future, creating the possibility of a different future. They come from science, philosophy, business, psychiatry, even comedy. Yet very few, if any, of their insights are part of the mainstream business discourse. And then one day it struck me, why not create a podcast that brings these voices and their insights into the center of the leadership conversation? And from that moment, Metaconscious Leaders began to take shape. Now, before talking more about Metaconscious Leaders itself, let's look through our 4 lenses. Our first lens is one of context. Important because it shapes meaning and purpose. The context within which humanity now finds itself has been given many labels, including polycrisis. The situation is widely regarded as being existential in nature for humanity, along with many other species of life. I established an environmental consultancy in 1990, and I saw at first hand all the predictions that have come to pass. And despite the knowledge being known, humanity has been unable to change its course. We now live in an epoch that will define the future of humanity and many other species on planet Earth. One book that I have found deeply shocking is David Wallace Wells's The Uninhabitable Earth. It presents in great detail the consequences of what has happened and continues to happen to our air, seas, soil, and climate, as well as covering politics and economics. It's a difficult read. I find it disturbing, but it's also brutally clarifying because it makes absolutely crystal that the time for action is now. There are no white knights that are going to ride in and save humanity. That responsibility is ours and ours alone. In Beyond Profit, a wonderful book co-authored by Victoria Hirth, she reminds us of Chief Avol Lookinghorse, who said, "Each of us is put here in this time and in this place to personally decide the future of humankind. Do you think you were put here for something less?" We're living at an extraordinary moment in human evolution. On the one hand, there's huge challenges arising all around us: climate, mental health, economic inequality, political division, technological disruption. So much so that in my darker moments, I despair that our culture is broken, our systems are unfit for purpose, and that we have taken some fundamental wrong turns along the way. But here's the paradox. On the flip side of this, I also find this time deeply hopeful, because every period of transformation follows a similar pattern. The old paradigm begins to lose vitality. It starts to break down. It clings on. It fights for its own survival. And yet, beneath the surface, something new is already emerging. Change often appears to take a very long time to come about, until suddenly it appears, and happens faster than we could have imagined. I believe we are living through one of these times now. Over the past 20 years as an executive coach, I watched the language of leadership evolve. Words and topics that would never have been spoken in boardrooms a generation ago are becoming commonplace. And there still remain many who are caught up in the exuberance of the moment, distracted, as it were, into talking about the wonderful plans of what it will be 10 years from now, the fantastical possibilities of what AI could do for us, the prospect of colonizing Mars, and so on. For it brings to mind an image of passengers on the Titanic, who, even after the ship has hit the berg and the bands continue to play, continue to talk about their plans for when they reach New York in record quick time. Really? The time for action is now, and the place for action is here on Earth. One of the great privileges of hosting Metaconscious Leaders has been discovering so many pathfinders. They are everywhere. Scientists, philosophers, entrepreneurs, psychologists, farmers, explorers, educators. Just shy of the mainstream media and public discourse. To many, they appear out of sight, but they are all over the world, and they are already realizing, signaling, building a different possibility, a different future. Which brings us to the questions. What is emerging? How does that play out in leadership and in business? And how do we navigate getting from where we are now to achieve a transition to a different future? Metaconscious Leaders exist to explore these questions and to illuminate, amplify, and share the thinking of people who are lighting up possible pathways ahead for us that are rich in possibility and fulfillment. Let's take a look now through the second lens, and that is business. Business is now one of the most powerful shaping forces in civilization today across the world. Historically, the influence of business has always been counterbalanced by other centers of influence, so the church, civic institutions, local communities, and in many societies, strong cultural traditions. But today, each of these are significantly weaker, which has contributed to a weakening of civic purpose and an increasing focus on the interests of the individual. to the point where now the purpose of business has largely become about profit. Ask most people what is the purpose of business, and the answer will be to make money. And yet, if you push a little deeper, many or maybe even most people instinctively know that this is not right. Don't get me wrong, this is not a downer on profit. Profit is essential, but it's not the purpose. Profit is to business what oxygen is to a human being, necessary for survival, but not the reason for existence. The purpose of business is to create value, to serve, to solve problems, to contribute, to support human flourishing. Business is not separate from life. The phrase, "it's just business," has become a convenient excuse for behavior that most people would never even try to justify in their personal lives. Far from being separate, business is an integral part of living, an integral part of life. Our busyness shapes families, communities, culture, politics, technology, and even the future itself. This is why the future of business matters so much, and why the emergence of purpose-driven, regenerative, and conscious businesses is so encouraging. There are evidently, to anyone paying attention to life, monumental changes and challenges in play absolutely right now. I believe business can play a huge role in shaping a different future for humanity and the natural world, to the one that we are barreling towards at the moment. And this then brings in leaders and leadership. I say this because the transformation that we need to achieve in short order is not a mere reconfiguration of the existing systems. It's a complete reimagination, a redesign from first principles. I could not have said that out loud 2 years ago, as I'd have struggled with the consequences of the statement. I simply couldn't see a realistic pathway as a ground for future optimism. As I hear some people say, it was the case for me, I could more easily see the end of the world than the end of our form of capitalism. But now, for me, this has changed because through Metaconscious Leaders podcast, I am meeting and coming upon so many inspirational thinkers, doers from all walks of life who are already demonstrating a path forward. And Metaconscious Leaders seeks to bring their insights right into the heart of businesses and share them with leaders, where there is a real yearning for change and communities that understand and can sustain what and how those visions might look in practice. Now, let's look at our third lens, our worldview. Every civilization rests upon a worldview, a philosophy, an underlying understanding of reality that is the foundation on which humans then derive meaning and interpret purpose and what is really important. From an adopted worldview flows the infrastructure of a society, language, laws, institutions, customs, and norms of behavior, and so indeed culture itself. All of these impact on how we see ourselves, what we value, how we organize society. Bernardo Kastrup, in his wonderful book, Why Materialism is Baloney, wrote, "One's worldview is probably the most important aspect of one's life. After all, our worldviews largely determine, given the circumstances of our lives, whether we are happy or depressed, whether our lives are rich in meaning or desperately vacuous, and whether there is reason for hope. It is thus very hard, if at all possible, to overestimate the relevance of the choices we make with our minds and hearts when it comes to defining our worldviews." Now, there are hundreds of philosophical traditions or worldviews, but at its simplest level, they're largely divided into two families of thought. The first being that reality fundamentally is material, physical, that consciousness is a derivative of the brain, and when you're dead, you're done. That's materialism. The second posits that consciousness is fundamental, that what appears as physical, in fact, arises from an underlying field of consciousness, mind or spirit or quantum fields that are not physical, that are non-physical. This is broadly referred to as idealism in one form or another, and these are general categorizations for simplicity for the moment. For thousands of years, philosophers have wrestled with these competing narratives. But throughout history, nearly every major civilization has adopted a worldview which was more or less akin to idealism, insofar as there was inherent or in each of those an overt aspect of the non-material, the spirituality. However, since the 17th century and the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, when scientific inquiry was uncoupled from religious authority, Western civilization has diverged from this historical pattern. Science in its own right has made enormous material advances and accomplished many great achievements, right through to today when the technologies at our disposal are literally beyond our own comprehension. But over time, something unintended has also happened. In the centuries that have followed the Enlightenment, as church and science took separate paths, religion lost its grip on society, just as science has come to be hugely successful at discovering and inventing these material things of great genius. As a society, we came to forget, or at the very least to significantly devalue, the day-to-day importance of any spiritual aspect of life. And our established worldview has become anchored in a specialist materialist mindset, to the point where now any sense of the numinous or the sacred has been drowned out by the relentless drumbeat of extractive short-term economics, a zero-sum game that has come to serve the interests of an ever-narrowing section of humanity. And yet, paradoxically, it's science itself that is now definitively pointing us away from materialism and matter being fundamental and back towards a number of alternative philosophies, all of which posit that fundamental even to matter is consciousness, spirit, a field of subjectivity, a quantum field, 17 of them, I understand. There are numerous names, but all point to something that is, as I called it a little earlier, more than physical, or behind physical, from which physical matter arises. One such model has already been discussed and inspiringly outlined by Jude Caravan on Metaconscious Leaders, and more will follow. And I find it particularly heartening when I listen to vigorous intellectual discussions between scientists and their theories in very everyday language with Buddhists and sages and spiritual teachers from all creeds and traditions, and witnessing the clear convergence of brilliant minds towards an understanding of life as being profoundly interdependent and exquisitely interconnected. So why does this matter? And what is the relevance of this to leaders and to business? Well, when in a bind, it's important to understand the bind. When confronted with a problem, it's vital to correctly frame the problem so as to be able to address it. And this often requires us to step out of a situation and see it from a distance to get the bigger picture. When we step outside of our society and culture and consider it objectively, we quickly perceive that our materialist worldview has shaped so many aspects of our society and culture and has become the dominant force shaping how we operate, even how we think and feel. And that, like every operating system, it has become invisible to us using it. It's the water we swim in. Once you begin looking through this lens, you start seeing it everywhere. Let me give you some examples, a flavor of what I mean, and make no mistake, you could write a book on this. For an example, in language, we routinely describe people as human resources, reducing persons to separate productive assets. For an example, in law, we can see that company law treats companies as separate legal entities with directors' primary duties centered on the success of the company and measured by financial performance and shareholder interests, with no consideration for the greater good. This narrative posits that the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder value or profit rather than to create value for society. For an example, in institutions which are created as bulwarks for society and its systems, in education we see that rewards are given for analysis, measurement, testing, and specialization, while giving far less attention to wisdom, consciousness, character, or interpersonal development. For an example, in our culture, success is typically measured by wealth, status, consumption, and career progression, rather than any wisdom or contribution to society or local communities. For an example, in economics, GDP has become one of society's principal measures of success. But it's a narrow and incomplete measure of well-being, as it fails to measure or even define what it means to flourish as a human, or take into account ecological health. These are all examples of how the very water we swim in is both shaped by and sustains the physicalist materialist paradigm, which we then have to perform within. Could it be that it's only by really recognizing the water that we swim in, the nature and the consequences of our adopted way of a worldview, that we can free ourselves to reimagine, enable, and sustain those shifts that are needed for humanity in the natural world to flourish in the future and espouse a wiser worldview that is backed by science itself? All systems are designed for a purpose, to produce particular outcomes. And so I hear many people saying that our systems today are not in fact failing, but rather that they're performing exactly how they were designed and are fulfilling the purpose that they were set. So maybe the purpose of our systems, including economics, is something that we need to re-examine. What does a well-being economy look like? And how could we transition to one? What does regenerative economics look like? And can we adapt our businesses for this purpose? These are some of the questions that I will be exploring with guests on Metaconscious Leaders. What is clear is that whilst the materialist worldview has resulted in fabulous technological advances, it has nurtured a culture that is powerfully mechanistic, fragmented, extractive, and competitive, and is manifestly failing to deliver well-being for the vast majority of people and the natural world, and is evidently unsustainable. If, on the other hand, we listen to what is now accepted science that shows us that consciousness is fundamental or something akin to it, then changing the world is not simply about rearranging external structures or reconfiguring the existing system, but fundamentally reimagining it. Einstein again said we can't solve problems at the level of thinking they were created. And this is the case now. And I'm inspired by visionary leaders who are already demonstrating possible ways ahead, thinking and being at a higher level of awareness, a level of meta-awareness. Before we move on to the fourth lens, it's worth noting that if we examine the intersection of the power of business and the materialistic nature of our culture, we can see that issues of business responsibility are more complicated than at first appear. It's easy to castigate businesses and leaders, business leaders, particularly of large companies. And whilst I'm certainly not holding a candle for poor behavior, I do think that it's worth understanding a little bit more about how many businesses evolve and the extreme pressures that can build over time. Most probably begin with high ideals. Founders create businesses to solve problems, serve people, and make a positive contribution to society. They establish values, shape the culture, and inspire others with a sense of purpose. But success can change the nature of businesses. Growth usually requires investment. Investors, as we know, expect a return, and companies may be listed on the stock market, and the share price becomes a hot topic. Pension funds, institutions, and private shareholders become owners, and directors acquire legal responsibilities to act in the interests of the company and its shareholders. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the original purpose can become overshadowed by financial performance. Founders, directors, and managers may find themselves serving a very different set of priorities from those that first inspired the business. And success itself can also change us and how we show up in the world. Wealth, status, and privilege can gradually erode the very values that created success in the first place. I don't offer this as an excuse. I raise it because I think it illustrates the power of the water that we swim in. Our laws, our language, our institutions, our economic systems all shape our decisions, even how we perceive ourselves, and often without us even noticing, which is precisely why operating at a metaconscious level matters, because it's only by becoming aware of the forces acting upon us that we can consciously choose to lead and structure businesses that remain true to their deeper purpose, creating long-term regenerative value for society, the natural world, and ultimately also ourselves. Let's now look through our fourth lens, which is that to transform our businesses, we as leaders need first to transform. As without, so within. How we behave is an expression of our internal operating system, our level of consciousness, say. If we are to transform our behaviors and how we show up in the world, how we lead, we need to transform our inner landscape as well. But I'm not a fan. I don't want to overdo the transforming ourselves piece so much as transforming how we perceive and understand ourselves. What I mean by this, it's not about becoming metaconscious. We already are so. This is a gift of being human. It's about learning and habituating, living and leading at this higher level of consciousness, at this higher level of awareness that we all have. This is less a case of changing our being and more one of recognizing and fully connecting with it and valuing it as a guide that can direct and inspire our actions, our doings. At lower levels of awareness, life tends to revolve around I, me, I'm. Whereas at higher levels of awareness, something shifts. We recognize interdependence. We recognize interconnectedness, shared destiny. Me becomes we. This doesn't eliminate individuality. It simply places it within a wider context. And when we as leaders begin to see from the broader perspective, leadership changes naturally. Ultimately, every business strategy is an expression of a way of seeing the world. Change the way we see, and the way that we lead will also change. So those are the four lenses I wanted to use to frame metaconscious leaders. So now, what is it becoming? I say becoming quite deliberately because I don't pretend to have all the answers. Metaconscious leaders isn't my vision alone. From the very beginning, it's been shaped by conversations with remarkable people who have generously shared their wisdom, challenged my assumptions, and helped refine its direction. I hope that continues because it's nothing if not a collective endeavor. We're living in extraordinarily challenging times in which it can be hard at times to feel positive. An understanding that I find helpful to steady my own perspective is that understanding of how paradigm changes come about. The old starts to fatigue and fracture, it clings on, and so forth, sometimes violently, and yet all the while, just beneath the surface, the new paradigm is already forming. And when it emerges, when the cracks in the old result in its crumbling, then the new norms are already present and rapidly become mainstream. Change happens then faster than we can imagine it. Metaconscious Leaders is a good news channel, a podcast that amplifies the phenomenal work and insights of outstanding leaders and is becoming a community that supports the choices of leaders to reshape themselves and their businesses with greater purpose. Something that has become increasingly clear to me is that we all experience moments of clarity, little epiphanies, moments when we suddenly see life differently and resolve to live differently. But then Monday morning arrives, the pressure of work, expectations, targets, the opinions of others, the culture we live in. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it all erodes our steadfastness and we can lose touch with what we knew to be true. That, I think, is one of the great values of community. Not that community tells us what to think, but that it helps us to remain true to what we already know. And so today, Metaconscious Leaders is a podcast. It has announced its first event, which is a residential retreat with Zen Master Rishido, entitled Zen and the Art of Entrepreneurship. And soon Metaconscious leaders will be establishing a community where leaders can continue and deepen these conversations, learn from each other, and inspire one another to lead with greater wisdom, courage, and purpose. Hosting Metaconscious leaders, I've never been more hopeful than I am today. Not because the challenges have become any smaller, they haven't, but because I now know that extraordinary people are already envisioning and realizing a different kind of future. And they are the pathfinders that want to share their insights and wisdom. And the invitation is there for us all to engage and participate. As someone once said, the future is already here. Now, it's just not everywhere. So if something that I've said in the previous minutes has resonated with you, if you believe that business can become a powerful force for good in the world, then I invite you to register on metaconsciousleaders.com, and we will keep you informed as new developments come to pass. I hope you'll join this particular growing community. Thank you for listening, and I hope our paths come to align. Be well.